Did prehistoric children make figurines out of clay? Roughly 30,000 years ago in what is now the Czech Republic, children likely sat digging clay from the ground where they lived, using it to form tiny ceramic animals and people. When the children were called away perhaps to eat a meal, they left the completed figurines, assorted legs and heads, and undefined objects scattered on the ground. Some were later fired in the hearth, and some were left to the elements, according to a team of archaeologists who published a paper about this example of prehistoric play in October. The evidence is powerful and a plausible explanation for what they're finding. We are trying to understand our ancestors and how we got here. These kinds of interpretations that create spaces for us to think about the fact that these were communities of people doing human activities and interacting with one another are essential. The oldest known ceramics come from a handful of sites in the Czech Republic and date back to about 28,000 BCE, roughly 10,000 years after the Neanderthals went extinct. A now iconic figure of a woman and assorted ceramics were found at a Czech site called Dolní Věstonice in 1925. Additional anthropomorphic and zoomorphic figurines were found over the ensuing decades, and in 2002, fingerprints were discovered on many of the objects. Archaeologists realized that though much was known about children during the period, gaps also needed to be filled. A large part of the archaeological record contains information about children learning to make stone tools and making art. In other times and places, children were very active in ceramic production. Evidence of children practicing the activity comes from sites in Egypt dating to 1800 to 1700 BCE and early and Middle Bronze Age sites in England dating back to 1500 to 1150 BCE, because children can safely get into ceramics at a very young age simply by playing with clay. Archaeologists have hypothesized that at least some of the ceramics at the Czech sites were made by kids. They conducted the first systematic study, including high-resolution photographs, of 489 ceramic artifacts to see if they could find evidence of novices making the ceramics, and if they could tell whether the novices were children. This research focuses on Paleolithic portable art, but she goes beyond examining solely what objects are or how they look. She also studies how the objects were made and what that tells us about their significance within a society. They looked at the size of the objects, as smaller hands tend to make smaller figures. They checked for asymmetry, whether or not the figures were the same on both sides, and they also inspected the difficulty of the steps taken to make the figure. Art made from mammoth ivory, bone, antler, and stone has also been found at the sites. This is significant because these materials would have to have been collected from the broader landscape. In contrast, the ceramics are made from clay from within the sites that could have been dug up by the makers. The children were more likely to use materials they could easily get themselves, rather than objects obtained by a hunting or scavenging party. There is much more diversity and inconsistency in the ceramic artifacts than in the ivory, bone, and antler art, one of the indicators that they were likely made by children. The figurines were made near a hearth, and then fired and left there, whereas objects made from bone, ivory, and antler were used all over the sites and included in burials. Not one piece of ceramic has been found in a burial. So it looks like the kids are practicing, experimenting, and playing with clay and then leaving it behind when they are done. Some objects may have been put on fire so the children could learn that step or preserve them. Several unfired little limbs and nondescript objects were also found at the site, which may have just been made for practice. So what it shows us is that we're getting the whole swath or the whole range of learning through play that goes on. In addition, in previous studies, scratch marks and fingerprints found on the objects were determined to belong to children between the ages of 6 and 10, and adolescents between the ages of 10 and 15. This work is representative of the shifting attitude among archaeologists toward the importance of studying children and the role they played in prehistoric societies. Well, Paleolithic societies had children, and those children were playing and doing their thing, and they had a rich material culture and a rich way of living. It wasn't just a kind of harsh, brutish lifestyle, and was far more similar to how maybe we are today. Archaeology often approaches the question of how we arrived at the here and now through big topics like agriculture and migration. However, a lot of how a culture changes and develops takes place on very intimate scales. For example, societies can shift based on the knowledge children bring into adulthood. Those smaller scales of family and community and individual intergenerational interactions are critical. Societies have always moved forward through the transfer of knowledge, but not every bit of information gets transferred from one generation to the next. Children and teens are the ones who decide what gets carried to the next generation, which makes them the original influencers. That's why studying kids and teens in the Ice Age is super exciting, because we often underestimate their contributions to the archaeological record. But we can see that through the choices they make, they influence the direction of human cultural evolution,